All right, so appreciate everyone stopping by today. I know we advertised this as our first performance school this semester. It started off by a suggestion from Coach Dorn to Anna originally on they have this new piece of equipment in here with our force plate, something that we use very frequently with testing all of our athletes across campus. And now that they have one in-house and we don't have to travel back and forth with it and work on timing and everything, we thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of find a way to educate and teach our strength coaches and stuff and everyone how to use it on a practical level, specifically with the Vol Force Decks platform, because we do use this across multiple teams and multiple facilities. I do know that our basketball team does use something slightly different, but for the most part we'll get 400 or so athletes tested on this specific piece of equipment. So we did want to cover some different things on how to use that, so that way, you know, you didn't have to rely on us if you wanted to do something daily. Obviously, we can help support, you know, big testing initiatives semesterly, but if it's something you wanted to do weekly, daily, and it was hard for us to time up, you could easily, you know, get it done with swimming or lacrosse, or Sam wanted to do soccer, softball. Same thing with Epstein and Bradford and stuff too. KJ,
Hey, what's up?
What's up?
How you doing?
Good.
That's kind of welcome my life.
Hopefully more people come in and I can yell at them too. So for a quick just review of the hardware, right? So the actual force plate itself, obviously you see it's wired, so it's not a wireless system, so it does require a connection to a power source and USB to the laptop. But from a spec standpoint, each plate weighs about 45 pounds each and can safely hold a capacity of 3,000 kilos, or 6,600 pounds. So it's pretty robust, right? So we can get a lot done on it. From a accuracy standpoint, the feet actually have load cell sensors in them, which have been validated through their white papers and research and stuff on being highly accurate. And they sample at a rate of 1,000 hertz, which is, again, extremely accurate. From a dual force plate standpoint, we do have the option to where we can get left and right leg data. So some companies provide a force plate which is just a single force plate, so we don't have the option to get information pertaining to the left and right leg, but their force decks option does offer that. So now going into some of the software stuff. So Force Decks does come with a suite of applications similar to Microsoft Office, right? So it comes with their main primary app, the Force Decks app, the Force Decks Jump app, and Force Decks Leaderboard, right? So all of these can be downloaded through Vol's primary website, the Performance Hub, and you do have to have IT permissions to download this to a computer. So if you ever need it on your laptop in order to do testing, KJ, you would have to, you know, get in contact with Ian and their crew to make sure they give you a password. Just like with everything else we try to download, which is a good thing, but they're really helpful with that stuff. As far as differences between the apps, the Force Decks app is the primary application that they offer, right? So you have to export data after you test, and it's really flexible. There's really not much you can't do on there in terms of managing your testing data, right? The Force Decks Jump app, which is fairly new compared to their main app, it makes testing in large groups a little easier. So you can set up, like, say you have a group of 6 lacrosse guys coming in beforehand, you can select those 6 profiles, and the first guy can go up, select his name, stand on it, it'll get his body weight, and then he can jump, and then once he's done, save the data, and then the next guy can go. So it provides ease and efficiency for testing in large groups, and the ability, if you wanted to just have it up and they could operate it potentially themselves after being on out, which can be helpful in certain settings. Obviously, it doesn't have all of the capabilities of the primary app, so that's the one we're primarily gonna go through a little bit today. And then the Leaderboard app is just something that we've used to just display the data. So it syncs up live with one of the 2 other apps, whatever which one you're using, and you're able to display leaderboards. So it'll show top 10 for the day, and then top 10 all time for your group. And it's pretty flexible, so you can select which variable you want to display. So if it's jump height, and if that's something you feel like it's easy to communicate and demonstrate and display, then it could be jump height, it could be peak power, peak force, whatever. Whatever variable you can collect, you can show on the leaderboard. So it's not just limited to a certain variable or metric. In terms of what kind of data you're getting when you run a test on the force plate, it's extremely simple, right? So it gives you force data, right? Again, which is picked up through the load sensors, and then time. So just with force and time, we're able to get a ton of information, right? 100 plus metrics and variables pertaining to force, power, impulse, velocity, a bunch of great information that we can potentially look at and make decisions on just on force and time. In terms of testing, right? So how, what kind of tests you're able to run on here to collect some of that information, right? ForceDex breaks it down into ballistic, isometric, and dynamic tests. These are not all of them, but they're examples of what they do offer and what you're able to test on there. Obviously, the number one that we use most frequently and we recommend everybody have in their program, whether that's semesterly or weekly, is the counter movement jump, or the CMJ, just because of the ease of being able to test that, it not being an overly stressful test. It doesn't require a lot of equipment. It's easy for the athletes to learn after the initial learning curve, right? Callum, like you've done it, you've done it a bunch. It's obviously awkward at first, but it's not something that's overly complex or complicated. So that's something we recommend with all of our teams and athletes, especially as a starting point in scaling up. Obviously, there's a lot of great tests on here that we can use and get a bunch of great information from that may be specific to what you want or what you're looking for. But the CMJ is a great starting point to kind of nail down regular testing and a routine of testing and a routine of data collection. Even if you wanted to dig a little deeper with other tests like a single leg jump or a drop jump or some of these isometric tests down here, the CMJ is always an excellent starting point and something that should be tested frequently.
Hey John, just for context, you've already got it up there. Can you talk about what a CMJ is?
Yep, so CMJ from a protocol standpoint would be hand stepping on the force plate. Actually, let's get, Adam, I know you're gonna be my demo guy. I don't know why you're hiding all the way back there. So we'll just have them step on for now, even though I'm not gonna actually run a test with the application. But, so you can go ahead and step on now, Adam. So from a protocol standpoint, we always have the athletes put their hands on their hips. So that way it kind of standardizes across athletes, right? Some athletes are gonna be really good at using their arms and timing that up and are coordinated, and that may be beneficial for them and certain jump outcomes and measures, right? But taking the arms out kind of standardizes that across. And it gives us, great information pertaining to what their lower body is capable of doing. So what we have the athlete do is step on, put their hands on their hips, and it's just a standard jump, like you would do a vertical jump test, like on a Vertec or a jump mat, except you're not reaching up to hit anything, you're not using your arms. So Adam, with the demonstration, will just quickly load, jump, stick the landing, reset. So it's a non-continuous test, so it's not a 1, 2, 3, but we'll typically have the athlete do 3 single jumps, and they can take as much time in between as needed to. So it's not something where we have to quickly get through, unless obviously we're limited on time to test and everything. So that is again CMJ, what we typically test a lot of, and you have the option, the ability to also test that using the arms as well. Obviously recommend that being more infrequent. There's the squat jump, which would be similar to the CMJ, but with a pause at the bottom. So that eliminates that stretch shortening cycle, or that ability for the athlete to use their elasticity. And we can do a couple different things in terms of pairing the data you're getting from that with your CMJ, seeing if there's any differences, and that may be able to guide training. That's for a later conversation. I'm not going to go through every one of these tests, but obviously, other than the ballistic stuff, you have your isometric stuff. So isometric mid-thigh pull is something that's heavily used in research in terms of identifying an athlete's maximum force producing capabilities, right? And you could potentially, replace some of your actual dynamic strength testing, like a max effort squat or deadlift. Obviously, it's a little more safe, and it does, depending on how you set it up, only give you their ability to produce force in whatever body position or angle that you put them in, but it does give you good maximum strength information. And then it also has some dynamic testing options, so either with a body weight or a loaded squat.
How strict is the protocol for that counter movement jump? So if my hands are on my hips, if the hand comes off the hip at all, is that a rep not counted? Is there any leeway? Like on a landing, if the hand slides down, like what's the policy on
So
that?
it's up to really the practitioner who's running the test. We typically will not count that, right? Just to try to be as consistent as possible. Because if you're thinking like in a research environment where you can control everything and keep everything consistent, that's a perfect world. But in a training environment, you're not able to replicate that environment. So keeping things standardized like that as much as possible, it will be helpful in collecting consistent data, right? Because you're not always going to get the athletes to test at the same exact time of day after the same exact warm up, with the same exact conditions like you would in research. So keeping that stuff as consistent as possible is helpful. So that's what we do. So in terms of what else we won't count, right, other than hands coming off hips, or if the athlete kicks their feet up in front of them while they're in the air, or if they tuck their knees to their chest, right? Because if you're estimating like jump height or anything based on the amount of time they spend in the air, them doing that can potentially manipulate that and give you some off or bogus data. So that's another thing that we try to control for, and we'll coach the athlete up on. We'll again not count the set if they don't follow some of those guidelines. Another thing too, which will be again based on you as the tester, would be how deep they land. That could potentially also impact the flight time if they're landing super deep, right? But again, that's probably a little harder to control than those other things. Any other questions before I go on? Good. All right, so in terms of just variables that we're able to get from some of our tests, again, I'm not going to go over every one. I'll go over some which we find important, but also we'll categorize them a little bit. So generally you'll get some of your output or performance variables. So regardless of test, that's just what your athlete is capable of doing or outputting or producing or performing on that test. So that's like your estimated jump height, which is either based on flight time, or they use a calculation using impulse and momentum. That's an option. Any eccentric or concentric peak power variables, peak force, rate of force development, impulse, all of those are great outcome and performance variables. We like to there's also options in here to where you get that information divided by body mass, right? We like to use that because it's easy to compare between individuals and between groups, right? Because obviously with some of your force and power measures, you're heavier guys, right? Like you don't have too many guys that look like this dude right here. But so his force and power, like absolute, are going to be higher than some of your smaller guys just because of his body mass, right? So if you're able, to use a variable that divides by body mass, you can compare amongst individuals, right? You can compare him to Tiger a little easier than you would based on absolute measures. So those are some of our output and performance variables. The jump strategy variables, these right here are ones that we typically look at in terms of fatigue throughout a season, right? Because an individual typically may be able to produce the same output in jump height or power or force, but do it in a different manner, right? Or use a different strategy to achieve that, right? So when they're fresh or on average or whatever, right? So if we're looking at eccentric duration, for example, right? They quickly load their jump when they're feeling really good and they don't have any fatigue, and then jump up a 45 centimeter jump, right? And then if fatigue is present, they could still potentially jump that 45 centimeter, but that eccentric duration be longer, right? So that could be an example of something that could indicate, fatigue. And we wouldn't look at just that one. We'd use some of these other ones, like RSI mod is one we really heavily look at. So that's reactive strength index modified. So that's like a version. I know, Dorn, you've done the drop jumps before, collected RSI off of that. So that's like a CMJ equivalent to an RSI, right? So it's obviously a little slower than would be dropping off a box and getting that quick ground reaction. But that is still something that involves jump strategy, and for some of you, for Carl and Adriana, right? So that would be basically a ratio of how long it takes the athlete from when they initiate the jump to when they leave the ground divided by their jump height, right? So the amount of time that they spend in the air. Again, so that involves not just the jump height, which is the outcome, it involves that strategy, so how long it takes them to jump. So if there's any reductions in that based on where they typically are, then that again could indicate, right, neuromuscular fatigue, so which could potentially be addressed. And again, kind of going back to our the dual force plate stuff, we can get asymmetry variables as well pertaining to eccentric, concentric peak forces, force at zero velocity, which is at the very bottom portion of the jump, and then also potentially peak landing forces if you coach the landing piece of it as well, if that's information you want to gather from that. So just for context, right, if we're looking at imbalances, we typically, like on a general basis, we'll look at anything from 10 to 15% imbalance as something to kind of start like a, this is something we should look into almost like a caution. It could be a one-off, but if it's a trend, maybe it's something we try to address. And anything over 15%, we'll try to address in training. So we'll talk to, using football for example, we'll talk to their strength staff and the athletic trainers like, hey, this guy has been showing an asymmetry of 15% with his right leg producing more force. Maybe we need to include some single leg stuff to that left side, especially if they're a rehabbing athlete. Right? So if they're a healthy athlete and you're still around that 10, 15 plus %, it may be nothing, and it may just be how they move. It could be functional, right? But if they are a rehabbing athlete who is clearly producing more force on the side that was not injured, then that's something that we should potentially look at and address. All right. So now moving on to the online software that Vault offers, where we talked about the ForceDex applications which you have to download to the computer. This software is cloud-based, so you can access it wherever, at home, away, on the road. It's basically a hub where Vault gives you the option to access all of your athletes' data in one place, coming from all of their products. So obviously we're a heavy force plate today, but they also have the Nordboard. So Nordboard data is organized and pulled and can be exported in there, and you can combine it with your ForceDex data and look at that stuff. And KJ, I'm gonna help get you like a dashboard set up on there so you can look at their stuff that we just did the other week. So that way you have that. And then they offer obviously other products that we don't currently have that you can also manage and look at that data in there. And then from a resources standpoint, we'll share this link, especially with our strength coaches. They have an awesome support page where they provide a bunch of educational content. Most of the stuff I've covered pertaining to all of their software and their hardware. But there's a ton of great information on here. If you ever wanted to learn more or look at it, get better at, tons of great stuff on here. I highly recommend.
Coach, if you're sharing your screen, it didn't pop up.
Oh,
there.
it didn't pop up? That's all good. We're good. I'll send that link out anyway, so it's no issue. So, all right. So before we go into actually pulling up the app and demoing some stuff, you guys have any questions? KJ, go on. Anybody else? Well done. Good. All right. Sweet. All right. So what we're gonna do is I'll just pull up the app, and Dorn, I may have you like potentially come up and attempt to just kind of go through it, so that way you kind of have that. So for today, Adam's gonna be our athlete, our test subject. So what we'll typically have, so this is the main ForceDex app, right? So this is where you'll be able to do some different things, right? There are athlete lists. Obviously based on, like we have the master account, so you'll have permissions just for men's lacrosse and swimming athletes, so you'll be able to manage those groups, right? So in here, you could organize it by sport, so you'll have it split up in swimming and lacrosse, right? But for today, we'll just select test athlete. So what you would do is select the athlete, and then you have this record test option right here. And so what that's going to do is it's going to pull up our actual testing screen. So every time we run a test between individuals before the start, is we're always just going to zero and reset the platform, especially because you know, if you have multiple athletes jumping on it, it may move, it may shift. Sometimes flooring can be uneven, but we always want to reset it in between athletes. So that would be with nobody standing on it. Obviously, you have someone just like a scale, right? So if you have, so if you have someone standing on it, you know, it could impact your measures there. So then the next thing we would do is actually weigh the athlete. I'm not. Yeah, I'll be there. You care? Yeah. All right. So we'll get a standing body weight. So it actually will show here too if they're standing evenly. So if it's at around 50-50, we'll know he's standing completely still and evenly. If it's shifting either to, so put all your weight to the left, Adam. Right, it'll kind of move around high to 100. To the right, we'll go lows into the single digits. Right, so we try to typically aim for the athlete to stand completely still. If it's anywhere between 45 and 55, we'll typically select it, especially if it's taken a long time to communicate that we want them to stand, you know, perfectly even. So we'll select their body weight, and then from there we'll actually start the recording. Right, again, we talked about right here on our y-axis, just giving us absolute force. Over here on the x-axis, we have time. And then we can kind of see, based on what we have selected here, right, the force that he's producing on both his left, which is the blue line, and then right, which is the orange line. So in addition to that, up here we have test type. So we can either, if we're either going to come in and we know exactly what test we're going to run, we can predetermine that and select what test that's going to be, or we can just select auto detect because it actually has it built in to where whatever he does, the software will be able to pick up based on the force time signature that this is the type of test that he just did, right? So it's on auto detect. He's going to put his hands on his hips and he's going to perform 2 counter movement jumps. Whenever you're ready, high as you can. Good. So he did those 2, and from here I'm going to stop the recording. Obviously you can see right here, we kind of had it running for a long time, that's why it's zoomed out. But it auto-detected both of those jumps as counter movement jump. And then it's highlighted, each one of those force time traces are highlighted by that green box. Now, if there was ever an issue and you needed to adjust on the fly, or if you saw something you didn't like you said, hands came off hips. Exactly, so I would select, okay, that was the second jump. I can just select that jump. We can remove it. You could potentially, if it detected the wrong type of jump, say for some reason it detected it as a loaded squat jump where he had a load on his back, you could also go in there and change it that way. And you can also do it after the fact too. So it's not like you have to do it right then and there. You can go back hours later and still adjust it.
What's your preference? Do you leave it on auto detect?
I leave it on auto detect unless I know, like, for the most part, it's really good at picking up certain exercises. For others, it may not, like squat jump sometimes is kind of iffy. So I'll preset it to squat jump if all I'm testing is squat jumps. Yeah, but if I'm testing multiple things in a row, I'll leave it on auto detect. Right. So that way you don't have to go back and forth and do all that. So from there, we can either analyze it and save, which will quickly, you know, identify, okay, this was a CMJ, here's a data point, save it, and then it'll open up the option to test another athlete. Or we can hit analyze and then select save after the point. So the first thing you'll see on here is based on his 2 jumps, you can customize what 4 panes you immediately see there, right? But you can quickly take a look, okay, this is what his jump height was on the first and second rep, the average between the 2, difference, peak takeoff force, RSI, whatever you want to look at, you can customize there. And you can also look at asymmetry results. If you wanted to look at every single thing they offer outside of these 4 primary measures, you would just go to the results table, select that circle at the top there, and you can look at the hundreds of different things if you need to look at it right away. Right, and then from there we would just save that. Save that test. You know, would exit out. And then go back to your main just look at the text. So it'll just
It exits out.
so if you hit analyze and save, it automatically will.
Take it back to this.
Yep, exactly. But if you go through that process and you hit analyze, save, you would have to manually save it out. Want to try one? KJ, you want to try one too? Sweet.
Hey, let's go through a lot of tests. Adam, if you can, give me some good jumps, give me some bad jumps that he's got to delete.
Yep.
Just give a bunch of things.
Yep.
Anybody else that wants to jump as well, you can hop in right after Adam, or you can run the machine.
Yep. So if you wanted to as well, like, so if you have a list of athletes, right, and you don't want to like scroll down to find a specific guy, you can start to type their name in and it'll pop up. So, yep. So if you hit start typing in test, okay. Right. So it'll give you, yeah, exactly. All the tests are ones come up. So if you typed in Grant Hayman and start typing in Grant, yeah, exactly. It'll come up. Yeah.
So you just go test that.
Yep. Test athlete and record all the info right there. Yep. All right, Adam.
Stuff on. Good to jump.
Good. Start. It's all those three things you want to go to, so that's helpful.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's a PR right there. Just give us one more awful one.
Awful?
Yeah.
I don't know if I can be that bad.
Good stop. And so you'll have your 3 jumps right there.
And I could, that second one where
Yep.
his hands released, I would take that, click on it, and then remove.
Yep. So if you feel good too, like if you feel good about all 3 of them, you don't even obviously you skip.
Right. You just skip that.
Yep. Yep. So from there,
You go to analyze and analyze and save.
so analyze, and then you can get all that information. Again, if you're going back-to-back athletes, you hit analyze and save, and it'll quickly.
Yeah, you don't waste time.
Yep. Exactly. So then you would save. Yep.
Who else? Who's next?
KJ's next.
Who's our next jumper? Mike, get in there.
Here you go.
Heck yeah, Horvath.
Mike Horvath, hop
Here we
up
go.
there. Let's go, Mike.
All right, so what actually, we'll switch the test up too, so we'll go squat jump. Don't step on yet, Mike.
Hey, you remember the squat jump? Remember the squat jump? Hold right here for 5 seconds, and then he'll tell you when to jump.
That's what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And hey, on that one, don't load at all.
Don't load?
Yep,
Just
come
start
right
from-
from the 0. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Mike, step on up. Stand still. Beautiful.
Dude, stand still.
Stand still, bro.
Still enough.
Oh my gosh.
That's not.
50-50.
Whoa.
Right on the money, KJ.
So we'll do an example of a squat jump right here. So same protocol in terms of hands on hips. So Mike will go hands on hips. Instead of jumping normally, going down fast, going up fast, jumping high as he can, he's actually going to pause at the bottom for about 5 seconds. So what we would typically do is we would have the athlete go to about a half squat, hold it there, and then wait for one of our commands to jump. So that way they don't have to guess. It hasn't been 5 seconds. So I'll do that for you. Just wait for me to say jump. Okay. Whenever you feel ready, go down. Hold it. Jump. Yeah, Horvath. Give me one more.
Same
Yeah.
thing?
Yep. You got to jump.
Let's go, Mike. Come on, babe.
You got to jump though. Jump.
Good.
Good.
Dude, use your
Go
right
ahead and
leg,
stop.
man. Use your right leg.
That's what I did.
Good, so kind of like we talked about too, right? It auto-detected it as a squat jump. So because he had that point in time where it was still static force, and then he jumped, it was able to identify that as a squat jump as opposed to the kind of. So
that cutoff 5 seconds? Like if you would only pause them 1 second, would it not?
Yeah, potentially. So another thing too, so he actually did a really good job, right? So sometimes when we get in that squat, that pause position, and an athlete dips down to initiate that force, right? You want to try to not allow that to happen or eliminate that, because that will also trigger it as a counter movement jump, right? But obviously too, we don't want them to utilize any kind of counter movement. We want it to be static, straight up, yep, straight up. But if it did trigger it again as a counter movement jump, you just select one of the bubbles, change it to CMJ, and then it'll do it for all jumps.
Doing it analyze?
Yep.
See what we got here.
34.
Whew.
I mean, that was better effort on your second one. I'm not. So essentially, like when you're testing, right? When you're going through the order, like the zero, the weighing, and the start, it's all at the top, and then post-test, everything's at the bottom. So analyze, save, analyze, and save, and quit. Yeah.
Where do you see the asymmetries?
So if you, yep, and then everything in the middle is looking at the data from.
Right leg down.
What?
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, for
Appreciate
sure.
it.
Hey, I'll interrupt here real
Yep.
quick. We're at 12:30, so traditionally with performance school, what we'll do is it's about a 30-minute little exercise, conversation, presentation, and then we break at 12:30. After this, it can be kind of like the after party. You can stay, you can stick around, we can continue working here, but you are free to go. It's very informal, and thank you for coming, but please stay if you want to. Thank y'all.
Good. Any questions for everybody? Cool.
Who wants to get on there next?
I know this was geared towards some of our strength coaches and our staff, so appreciate y'all coming in and learning a little bit about force split testing and what we're doing.
So I guess one question I have, and we can get some other people. So we have a different group of people in here. We have, of our performance team. We have performance psychology, performance science, strength and conditioning, athletic training. We have faculty in here. What's the so what? So like for us as a group, if we're sitting around trying to solve a problem, like yeah, it's cool. It's some data, it's some testing. How do I, that's making a decision on the athlete, integrate this into my day-to-day?
Right, so this is going to give us, obviously, we have multiple departments that are involved for our student athletes. We take a holistic approach. So this is going to give us information pertaining to their physical performance at this point in time. So either today or trend-wise, where they're going. So we talked about some of our performance measures or variables on output, right? So jump height, power, where are they compared to where they typically are? Right? So if they're trending down or if they're low, is it something where they're just physically fatigued, or is it something where it's potentially because of other factors that are involved that are going on in life, other mental components, stressors, classroom, whatever. So this gives us more information pertaining to the physical, but some of that may lead into why they're performing, or with some of the output stuff, or some of our jump strategy. That we were talking about, what we usually use to monitor fatigue. So it could be a trigger, right? So as a strength coach, as a sports scientist, I'm going to look at that information and go, what's going on with this guy? May lead, or girl, right? It may lead to an additional conversation, especially if everybody else is in a great place, right? If it's a time of year like training camp or at the beginning of the season or late in the season, and you kind of expect fatigue to be present, and it's kind of team-wide, right? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a conversation with the sport coaches on how can we adjust or do things a little differently on the field. But if it's an individual compared to the rest of the group, is it the way I'm training them, or is something else potentially going on? And we can tie different sets of data into that, into how we can potentially find the root of that issue. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think we're all a part of creating a plan, and at different times of the year, you would expect these jump numbers to go down. At the beginning of a season, preseason camp, fall camp, whatever that may be, where the volume is extremely high, there's some metrics on here that are extremely sensitive to fatigue. John mentioned RSL mod. That is a really, really sensitive metric. As an athlete becomes fatigued, their loading time is going to be prolonged. So that number is going to show some signs of some change. So let's say we always, it's really easy for us to think about, oh, we need to pull back because maybe it's going a little bit too high. We're getting too much fatigue. But the opposite is also true. Let's say we're at the beginning of a preseason camp and we're not seeing signs of fatigue. Maybe training is not hard enough and we have extra capacity to give. So there's some metrics here, obviously to get the strength staff to train the physical, but there's also some signs that can be a telltale sign of what your plan is doing as a sport coach. So there's a lot of applications here that we can look at across the board.
And we haven't even addressed the athletic training piece too, right? Obviously we're talking strength coaches and how to adjust training, but the same information can be used for a rehabbing athlete too, right? Especially if you have a ton of different data from when they were healthy. You can then potentially set landmarks throughout the rehab process and identify potentially where they are in that process. Especially because you're able to collect so much more information than you would for typical rehab and return to play testing, whether that's a single leg, repeated broad jump or whatever. So you're able to collect a lot more information on something like this, which can help the rehab process.
John, could we use this athlete right here as an example of somebody, let's say they've had an injured limb. So I'm seeing my concentric box is orange.
Yep.
And then basically everything else is blue. So that's like to me that's they slow themselves down with their right foot. Or I'm sorry, they slow themselves down with their left, but all their power comes from their right.
So
Maybe.
the way this software is set up, it makes like visually it's not great, right? Because it shows like right, this is concentric mean force for an example. And it shows, oh wow, like it's all over to his right side, right? But it's only a 6%,
Yeah.
6% difference. So unfortunately, like the way the software is set up, it kind of adapts to whatever numbers are in here. So even though it's showing over to the right, you still have to kind of check the numbers. But to your point, right? I don't have eccentric on here right now, but if you were seeing where, say this was eccentric force and this was above 15, even 20% going down to the left side, and they were rehabbing back from a right leg injury, right? That could potentially mean that their right leg is deficient, right? Their injured side is deficient in their ability to eccentrically produce force, right? So you could potentially train him with exercises that focus on eccentric loading, whether that be like a split squat, like a true single leg variation, something if they're early in rehab, something more on a fixed piece of equipment, or if they're further along, something or quicker eccentrically low, like a plyometric exercise.
Do you think for guys coming back from a lower extremity injury, is it good for them for our metrics here? And granted, like there's different sports. So if I'm working with soccer or lacrosse, where they're constantly clanking on one and rotating to the other, is that something that you want to see a closer? Like, all right, we're within 15%, that's good, or should it be a little closer? Because I get nervous because you know me with hamstrings. Like, if we're 10% difference, that's a red flag to me.
Right.
Maybe it shouldn't be, and I'm just being over cautious. But if it's a common injury constantly like pounding, I have a sport on turf that ACL is a huge deal. Is that something where maybe we like kind of look at it and we want to get a little bit closer?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of the conversation around like functional asymmetry. Like, is the imbalance present actually something that is beneficial to their skill on the field, right? So there is some gray area, and there's nothing like hard evidence that says you should like reduce that. We don't know if it'll So I think you're kind of spot on, right? Like as long as it's kind of within the bounds,
Yeah.
like 10% around that range, I think you're probably okay. But then you also need to know like from a pure output standpoint too, like where are they? Right? Because they could be symmetrical or at 10% or whatever, but their output still isn't good. They're not producing a lot of force, not producing a lot of power, but they're symmetrical, right? So you want to adjust their ability to produce and absorb force in order to kind of help protect against injury, as opposed to looking at asymmetry, because maybe they're not strong enough and able, in terms of being able to withstand the demand of what they have. So it's more of an output than improving that as opposed to shrinking. But again, going back to within an injured athlete, like should potentially be prioritized in that athlete's game, especially if it's a chronic, like we talked about one of the guys who continuously has an issue. So if it's showing up on that, and it's okay, it should be addressed for a long time. I think.
Yeah.
For the rehab
Yep.
portion, perhaps with force plate data, and also that perhaps put the EMG on the major muscle
Yeah.
group for the wireless wise, so that when you jump it, and how the glutes and the hamstring quads and all that, genetic chain kind of things to cooperate with that maybe
Yeah.
help for not necessarily solution, but it's more so cross-function enough that they know that data to actually hopefully help for the what need to do for the single leg, maybe squat, whatever. But
Right.
nice to have another information in addition to the jump. Perhaps we can help for training regimen for specifically for that specific matter, perhaps.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about too, right? So this gives us the mechanical information in terms of the force or the power or whatever that leg is able to produce. Right? So the EMG could potentially help us identify which muscles are contributing or not contributing to them producing that force. Right? So if we identify there is an asymmetry, if we do have the ability to get to get some of that information, maybe we can identify, okay, it's a quad issue, or it's a hamstring issue, or it's something going on with the calf, glute, or whatever, so that can help us kind of refine that training or that rehab plan even more. So it could provide another layer of data, exactly. So obviously this is something where maybe it's an initial check or flag because it's easier to implement, it's less invasive, less equipment involved, but once we do have that information that shows us, okay, this is what their force is doing, then we go and add EMG to get that secondary layer or refine that process.
How much of the information and assessment stuff do you actually share with the athlete, or is it more so for you guys and for training and planning purposes?
Right, so great question. I think, or we think as a whole, right, in order to get great information, you have to get great effort. So the athlete, I know, like buy-in, because it's so cliche, right? But athlete buy-in is extremely important. It's something that we found is extremely helpful in doing that, especially obviously with our football program. One of our core values being compete is showing that leaderboard. So that way they're able to see where they rank with their peers. Even if it's not a piece of information that we technically look at, but if it's something they understand, like jump height, right? Us just showing that, being able to rank them, being able to say this is where you are, this is where you were, and just relaying that information helps us get really good data because they give great effort. So we will frequently share that at least some data, not all of it with them, especially if it's positive information, right? Like for an athlete that is coming back from injury, we have pulled up like their right and left asymmetry data or their output data and be like, hey, this is where you are right now, like you're in a great position, like coming off of your ACL, you're under 10%, like we will, as a confidence booster, use that to kind of reinforce the stuff that the athletic training staff is and then obviously too, like, not on the spot, but if we get the data back when we are starting to see there's maybe some fatigue or their performance is dropping, maybe we later have a conversation with them and help them find ways to recover if they are fatigued. So use our wellness data, that data, and kind of get, okay, well, you're sleeping poorly, so maybe we focus on sleep. You reported poor nutrition, let's get with Leanne or Nick or whoever to help make sure that we're good nutritionally. So that way they're involved in the process and they're not just test dummies and giving us a bunch of data. We're able to help them on a particular level.
John, is there an optimal day that you would recommend doing this? Like, let's say we're in season. Is it like, hey, we always go game day +2, or
Right.
like, is there for football, like, we always do it here because we know they're sufficiently recovered?
Right.
Or is it more like, as long as you consistently do it on that day of the week, that's all we care about, even if the output's not as
Yeah.
close to 100%?
I think it's situational. Right. So obviously, us right now with like football, we know like their schedule and their structure, and all the stuff they have going on, meetings and training sessions and practices and study halls and whatever. So we just build it into their lift. Like in season, they'll lift twice a week. Right? So we'll build it in there.
So you're doing it twice a week?
Yep. So in season, we'll do it twice a week. Depending on where we are too, right? We may scale back, potentially do it once a week, just to kind of give them a breather if needed, because they do it so often and so frequently. So we may adjust that way too. But we're also exploring potentially doing it at the end of the week, closer to game day, to gauge their freshness and readiness going into the game. So like a game day -1, like where are they? So that is something we've talked about and explored. So if you're able to fit that into your program, that may be something to think about. But definitely for sure early in the week. So say you have competition. This is obviously one competition a week schedule, right? But not the day following, but potentially the day after that, because you'll at least give them a good 24 hours plus to at least recover a little bit. Because obviously, like depending if you have a guy that played every minute of that game, will probably not be feeling too great the next day. It gives you an opportunity to kind of get with them from a recovery aspect, and then maybe the game day +2 is a good starting point for the week. So maybe starting point, maybe a middle if needed, and then a game day -1.
You just wouldn't share the data game day -1. You tell them all
Hell
the
no.
jumps were great.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something that we talked about as well. Like if we're getting that information day before the game, is especially if the guys are pretty in tune with what they typically do. To John's point, us sharing that with them. So say it's a guy that jumps at 65 centimeters pretty consistently. We see these at like 56. We're not gonna be like, oh, that's not very good, right?
It's 2 yards good.
Yeah. Oh, great job, man. Get out of here. So, yeah, we disclose that information.
In that 2-day-a-week testing, what's your variation for the different types of tests? Is it typically the CMJ, or how do you mix in the different other kinds?
Yep. So, like within research, right, the drop jump, which is just stepping off of a box, reacting quickly off the ground, is typically the most sensitive to fatigue, but it's also potentially more demanding from a force and tendon standpoint, right? So we do not do that in season. We typically do stick with the CMJ just because, again, it's least demanding on the athlete compared to some of our other tests, but also gives us some of that stretch shortening cycle or reactive strength information. Right? So we typically would stick with that. With our bigger athletes, we try not to do that for those reasons. So we've identified other options for them, whether that's like a grip test or potentially like a mid-thigh pull would be good for larger athletes as well. And identifying if there's any force reductions, isometric tests throughout the season, because it is less demanding. But again, from an efficiency and equipment standpoint, that's going to be more time. It's going to take up more time, more resources, more equipment, all that stuff. So, and it's harder to standardize compared to just jumping. So that's why we typically stick with CMJ.
Thank you.
Great
Any-
questions. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Feel good? All All right, if anybody wants to stick around and either use the platform or to actually jump, you're more than welcome to. But thank you guys so much for coming. We want to try to have this just like we did last year, every other Wednesday. A little bit of mix of classroom, a little bit of mix of practical. We'll spread it around. I think in the coming weeks, what we're going to have is more of a theoretical side of using force plates with one of our liaisons with Vald Performance, the company that manufactures our plates. So we'll let everybody know there. But also on the flip side, if you're interested ever in presenting something, it doesn't matter what it is, just something pertaining to performance, we're always open to that. You can talk to myself, John, you can talk to Carl, anybody that you feel comfortable with, just bring it up and we'll get you on the docket. So thank y'all so much for being here. Appreciate it.
For next week too, that'll be online.
Virtual.
Yeah, virtual.